warm welcome to you. You're joining us once again at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. And as we continue to talk about Sri Lanka's economic crisis, reforms agenda launched by the government as well as a way out of this crisis, we have with us an individual who's currently visiting in Sri Lanka, who is working with Sri Lanka in terms of overcoming the crisis and supporting Sri Lanka through a global network of financial organizations to support Sri Lanka's way out of the crisis. We have with us the visiting Vice President for South Asia region of the World Bank, Mr. Martin Reiser. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you so much. Very nice to be with you.
You're here in Sri Lanka just days after we heard of the World Bank launching and supporting Sri Lanka with the new country partnership framework for Sri Lanka. We've heard about $700 million of support to the country, which comes in two segments. But I'd like to first ask you about your observations of Sri Lanka's crisis situation. The World Bank has been talking and predicting, forecasting Sri Lanka's way out of the crisis and what needed to be done. But as you set foot here, what observations do you have about the country's economic situation at present?
So this is my third visit to Sri Lanka in the last 9 months or so. And I think while the first visit was characterized by a deep sense of concern, there was urgency. The government was still in the process of formulating what they were going to do. The second visit came just after the IMF had approved, the IMF board had approved their extended fund facility. Now the third visit comes after we approved a new strategy, and I can see a progressive improvement in the situation. Clearly we're not over the hump yet, we're not completely out of crisis, but what the government has done has considerably stabilized the situation. We're coordinating among the development partners to try and provide adequate support, and hopefully this is going to be reflected in the second half of the year also in an improvement in the underlying economic situation, because what people care most about at the end of the day is, are there enough jobs? You know, do I have a way to support my family? And that's ultimately how the success should be measured. Hopefully we're going to see that in the months to come.
In terms of growth prospects for the country, how do you analyze the economy performing going forward?
Well, you know, we're still climbing out of a fairly deep contraction of the economy that was brought about by the currency crisis, the default on external debt, which meant that Sri Lanka lost access to any financing. That's still reflected in the underlying numbers for GDP. So GDP still year on year has been declining. We predict still a decline for the year as a whole. But as I said, the second half of the year, we should start seeing improvements. So at the end of the year, I think we're going to be in a better place than we are today.
You did mention, the World Bank mentioned that the crisis currently offers a historic opportunity for deep reforms here in Sri Lanka. We'd like to ask you what you want Sri Lanka to prioritize at this current juncture, especially when we talk about launching a reforms agenda, but then engaging with creditors to secure a proper debt restructuring framework here.
So clearly the debt restructuring is critical for the viability of Sri Lanka's economy. The government cannot afford to pay back all of the debt, so it does require relief from its external creditors. It has recently, the Parliament has approved a domestic debt restructuring that will provide some additional relief. With that space, the government will have the resources to pay teachers, to pay doctors, to provide proper social support. So it's absolutely critical for the viability of the program. But then I think ultimately, you know, what this crisis, you mentioned, it's an opportunity, offers Sri Lanka is the ability to look at the underlying growth model. And you know, in in the years to come, hopefully Sri Lanka's growth will be driven much more by private investment, by stimulating all the entrepreneurial talent that is in the country that is currently going abroad because the opportunities are there. We want young people in Sri Lanka to think that the future is here and that there are opportunities here in tourism, that there are opportunities in the IT industry, there may be opportunities in moving up the value chain and agricultural production. Sri Lanka has a lot of assets. It has, by regional standards, still fairly well-educated population. It should be capitalizing on those assets, but it's really the private sector that will make that possible. What the private sector needs, most of all, is transparency and predictability of the policy framework. And an even playing field. If the government is giving preferences to state-owned enterprises that distort the competition, or if regulation can be changed to benefit one particular company over another, then investors are going to say, why should I put my money there? Or if the macroeconomic situation is not managed responsibly, again, investors will shy away. But now with a macroeconomic program that hopefully will bring some stability, with debt relief that will support that, and then with the right structural reforms, state enterprise reform, opening up for investment, liberalizing some sectors of the economy for more competition, I think private investors will look again at Sri Lanka and they will see a lot of opportunities. That's really where we think the opportunity is, and that's what we would like to support. Of course, we can only provide support. The hard work has to be done by the Sri Lankan people.
In what form will this support come to Sri Lanka?
Well, we in the World Bank, we have the possibility to work directly with the private sector through the IFC. So the IFC can invest alongside a domestic company or a foreign company to create jobs, to expand the economic opportunities in the country. What the World Bank does, it works on the government side, and so we have, over the crisis situation, we provided financing for the emergency import of fertilizers, of medicine. We will continue to support the health sector, we'll continue to support the education sector. We have ongoing investments in the agricultural sector to improve agricultural productivity. And of course, we have provided, and you mentioned the 700 million, we have provided that amount to go directly into the budget to support, on the one hand, the revamped social assistance program, to provide support to those that need it most, and on the other hand, to help the government deal with the fiscal emergency that it has. And that support comes in the context of a broader reform program where we help work on SOE reforms, we help work on banking legislation, we help strengthen the financial sector safety net, and so on and so forth.
The 700 million we're talking about, it will come in 2 disbursements, and there was mention that part of it, of both disbursements, will go into poverty alleviation to support the vulnerable segments of society. World Bank also predicts that the segment in poverty will increase by 2025. So how do you propose, and what support will be forthcoming, especially targeting the most vulnerable segments, especially looking at 2025 and beyond?
So we have to look at, where are we today? We are in a situation in which poverty in the country is twice as high as it was before the crisis. And as you mentioned, because economic growth continues to be slow, poverty continues to increase. At some point when economic growth will pick up again, and hopefully this will be as early as next year, poverty should start to come down again. But clearly we have more people that are poor. At the same time, the old system was covering a lot of people, but they weren't receiving a lot of money. So where we want to move to is a system, or what we would like to support is a system the government designed where the assistance is targeted to the ones that are really identified as requiring that assistance. That required a new social registry to be put in place. That was a big effort that was rolled out over the last few months, that every family had to report what assets do you have, what is the income that you have, and then there are certain metrics that determine whether you fall within the purview of this social assistance program. Obviously, that's a difficult change. Some families that used to receive support don't receive it now, but it's a reflection of the fact that you don't have more money in the budget. You have more people in absolute need as a result of the crisis, and so you do need to find a way to target the assistance more effectively. That's what we've been working on with the government, and that's what's now being rolled out. And I hope that the people that are really in need will feel that they're getting the assistance that they require. And then, of course, it can't stop there. I mean, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, what all families in Sri Lanka want is a job that allows them to support themselves. And that's what we need to work on with the private sector, with the reforms to improve the investment climate. The two have to go hand in hand. No country can survive just by providing handouts. At the end of the day, it's the economy that needs to support the welfare of the people.
The Sri Lankan economy has been heavily dependent on handouts, especially surrounding elections, but I know you will not talk about politics. Moving on to the tax reforms program, development partners as you, the ADB, or even the IMF, especially the IMF, has been talking about Sri Lanka working towards a stringent mechanism where we improve our tax income, revenues. Have we taken the right direction here?
Well, I think the government should be complimented for having reversed some of the poorer decisions that were taken in the past. The tax rates were unnecessarily reduced, and that contributed to the crisis because the government didn't get the revenue to pay the bills and to pay the creditors. But a comprehensive tax reform cannot just rely on raising tax rates. You also need, and I think this is fundamental, you need to increase what economists call the tax base. You need to make sure that everybody pays taxes. And I think in that regard, there's still some further work to do on improving the tax administration, making it more transparent, making it more efficient. We're working on them to improve, for example, electronic filing, that makes it easier for people to pay taxes, but also to look at, the special arrangements that have been created for certain industries and tax exemptions here and there. At the end of the day, a better tax system is one where the rates are not too high, but everybody pays. And that's a longer-term reform effort. I think the first steps have been taken. You see revenues are already up significantly compared to what they were a year ago, but they're still low by international standards. I mean, we're still talking about revenue in the order of maybe 10, maybe 11% of GDP. That's very low, and that's probably too low to support all of the tasks that the Sri Lankan government has, from investment in improving infrastructure, providing better healthcare, providing quality education, providing a decent social assistance system. That requires resources at the end of the day. Yes, we also need to look at the rationalization of expenditures. We only spoke about the social welfare system so far, but there are other areas where there may be scope for further improvement in the targeting of expenditures. Those will also probably will have to be looked at. But coming back to the tax system, I think the next step is broadening the base.
You mentioned this is lower compared to the international standards, but here in Sri Lanka, with the tax reforms, with the recent income tax reforms introduced, many felt that the middle income earners were targeted and the corporates were not. And that also, for a long time, we've been talking about a middle income trap, and added to that, we're talking about high income tax on the middle income earning segment. So is there a risk here?
Well, I think I spoke about exemptions. The exemptions apply mostly to corporate, to corporate taxes. So when I speak about looking again at some of the tax expenditures, some of the tax exemptions, improving tax administration, I do have in mind the contribution that the corporate sector makes. So everybody needs to contribute. It's not one group versus the other. Everybody will need to contribute. But it's also true that, in most countries, at least when it comes to personal income taxes, the incidence, most of the tax income does happen to come from the middle classes. That is a reality that high-income countries, middle-income countries all face.
Right. As Sri Lanka engages with international creditors, our external creditors, to forge an agreement in terms of debt restructuring, we're also talking about countries that are supporting Sri Lanka. I know that you were previously country director for China. So currently, when we engage with our creditors, China is not on the same platform, but there is a country-to-country partnership. How do you view this situation, especially when it comes to Sri Lanka striking an agreement with our external creditors to secure a sustainable debt treatment strategy?
Well, the IMF went to their board with financial assurances from all of the major official creditors. That's a condition for them to go to the board. Those financial assurances mean that China, together with the other creditors, the ones of the Paris Club, the ones associated with but not in the Paris Club, will offer a debt relief on comparable terms. Comparable treatment is absolutely core. And this is now what is being discussed with the official creditors. What is the cutoff date? How exactly do you define the comparable treatment? 2 rounds of meetings have been held so far. We hope that a 3rd meeting will be held relatively soon. And yes, time is important, and I do hope that China, together with the other official creditors, will move and will be true to the commitments that they made to the IMF board and to the Sri Lankan authorities. But really, the nature of these discussions is not something that I'm privy to. I just hope that we reach a positive conclusion soon, because Sri Lanka really does need that space. Otherwise, a lot of the other things that we've just been talking about are going to be very difficult to deliver. So I think there is in my mind, a clear relationship between settling the issue with the creditors and having the policy space to move ahead with the difficult structural reforms. And ultimately, this should be in the interest of the creditors too, because if the reform program is successful, if the reforms are sustained and continue, ultimately the country is going to do better. That's going to open up more opportunities for them, and is going to make sure that whatever restructured debt is left is for certain going to be repaid. So I think the two need to be seen as 2 sides of the same coin.
What opportunities do we have working with the region? You are overseeing the region, managing a portfolio of some $55 billion through the World Bank here for the region. What opportunities does Sri Lanka have here working with our neighbors, especially our region, South Asia, through connectivity, greater connectivity in the region, and also achieving better benefits within the region for a win-win situation?
Well, I think there's lots of scope for greater regional cooperation. The South Asia region is the region that is least integrated economically of all regions in the world, and that despite the fact that people have close cultural ties and, many speak, at least most people speak English, even if it's not their first language. So there are lots of reasons why within South Asia, economic connections could be closer. I think for Sri Lanka, there is a few areas where I see, even in the short to medium term, real prospects for improvement. You mentioned connectivity. One of those is digital connectivity, payment systems. I think, India, which is the big neighbor next door, has developed a really interesting system with individual identification numbers tied to a payment system, tied to, it helps tax administration, it helps build up a more inclusive credit system, a more inclusive financial system. These are all benefits I think Sri Lanka could could try and learn from that experience, and at the same time create closer connections, which will help, for example, with tourism. Indian tourists are the largest number of tourists visiting Sri Lanka. They're used now to pay with their mobile phones. If they can do that using the same payment system as abroad, that's making it much easier for them to move around the country. That's just one example. Another example would be in the energy sector, where Sri Lanka has significant potential to develop renewable energies, but so far has had very limited development of that sector. Now, it so happens that Sri Lanka's renewable energy potential is complementary to some of the renewable energy resources in neighboring Indian states. And so by building an interconnection, both sides could benefit. So it would be possible for Sri Lanka to import cheap and most likely renewable power from Tamil Nadu, for example, when they have a surplus, and vice versa, export power surplus from Sri Lanka to Tamil Nadu. Now, for that to work, you need a complementary domestic reform. So you need the Ceylon Electricity Board to continue in its restructuring and reform effort. You will need an independent regulator. You will need to find a way to connect the Indian power exchange with the regulatory system in Sri Lanka. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen. But the opportunity is very significant and could provide cheaper power for both sides. So that's another example. Obviously, transport, maritime transport is a big advantage for Sri Lanka. It has deep seawater ports that are being used, for example, by vessels from Bangladesh for transshipment. More trade, more open trade regimes could allow Sri Lanka not just to use it for transshipment, but to use the same to then transport its own cargo and bring in more imports and make its economy more competitive. So there are many, I think, many opportunities for closer economic ties within the region, and ultimately from the region to the rest of the world.
But in your view, what challenges have you identified that our countries together can work to overcome these challenges and strike greater connectivity within our region?
Well, I mentioned, in the payment system and in the connection, that requires agreements between the two central banks. In the power sector, that requires agreements between the regulators, ultimately between the governments. We have been, for a number of years now, sponsoring a round table of power secretaries from around the region. And they meet on a regular basis to try and discuss these issues. And what the message that we have is, a lot of these issues are quite technical. They require a lot of preparatory work. But if there's political will, I think there's a lot of support that the region can get from the ADB, from organizations like the World Bank, to try and catalyze this. And ultimately, I think this is a private investment opportunity.
I'd like to go back to talk about the World Bank's New Country Partnership Framework program for Sri Lanka. I remember reading the statement where you mentioned that you're looking at improving economic governance, and there are priority areas for the World Bank. But if we look at governance and economic governance, this has been a big topic of interest here in Sri Lanka, importance to Sri Lanka, especially looking at the past. But going forward, how do you suggest Sri Lanka look to tighten our economic governance, the framework, and ensure that we improve going forward?
So governance is ultimately it's a broad term, but what I understand by it is, as a citizen, I know what my responsibility is, I know what the responsibility of the government is, and I can more or less rely on the fact that if I discharge my responsibility, i.e. I follow the law and I pay my taxes, the government will do the same. Right? So fundamentally, that's kind of what I think governance is all about. Now, what are some of the dimensions of this? Obviously, more transparency is good. So one area in which we're working with the government is public finance management, so that when there is a budget, the citizen has a chance to look at what is the budget, where is the money going to be spent. There are audited accounts that tell you whether the money was spent in the way that it was originally allocated, and if it wasn't, what was the reason for it. There is, a reasonable correspondence. The deviation is not too large. The same is true between different levels of government. So there's some predictability in the resources that they have. So that's one example. Debt management is another. That the government tells you when they're going to borrow, what they're going to borrow for and how much they have borrowed and how much needs to be repaid and when. Debt management is another area in which we're working. State-owned enterprises. That if a state-owned enterprise exists, why does it exist? What's the objective? Is it supposed to make money? Is it supposed to follow the public interest? If it's making losses, why is it making losses? Are we covering those because people were not working effectively, or because they took some private money out of the company, or are the losses because they're operating, they don't have the tariffs to cover the costs in which they're operating. So more transparency, I think, helps. And that's why we're trying to work on different pieces of legislation to make it clearer. What are the responsibilities? What can citizens expect from the government? What can they expect from from public enterprises? And then vice versa, I think the government has a right to ask, to pay taxes, to follow the legislation, to not ask for special treatment, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we mean by improving economic governance. Mm-hmm. It's a complex and difficult task.
Certainly. You did mention that we're working towards new pieces of legislation, but here, what advice do you have for Sri Lanka to look at new laws and regulations and bring it into, make it into legislation so that we can improve our economy, especially how we are governed and how we move forward?
There's a lot. I mean, Parliament has already passed quite a few pieces of legislation, and there is a relatively long list of laws that are under consideration. Just in a couple of days, I was told the Parliament will read a new law on central bank independence. Another important part of good economic governance is that the central bank has a clear mandate to ensure price stability and ensure whatever other mandates the government wants to give it, but is not responsible for other things. Mm-hmm. There is a legislation under review to deal with strain in the financial system. The government's working on a new investment law to make an even level playing field for investors. They're working on a new SOE law to clarify the governance of state-owned enterprises. So all the things I was talking about require legislation, and that's being worked on.
Before we move on to our next segment of the discussion, I'd like to talk a little more on the SOE reforms program. World Bank's IFC is working as a financial advisor to reform one of our state-owned enterprises. But at the same time, you mentioned transparency is important. But what other priorities do you think Sri Lanka should focus on, especially as we embark on this reforms era?
You mean in the area of state-owned enterprises?
State-owned enterprises.
Well, I think fundamentally you need to clarify, why do you have them? Mm-hmm. Do you have them to provide jobs, or do you have them to do something that the private sector cannot do? I think the international experience that has worked best is if there is a clear policy mandate for the state-owned enterprises. Once you know why you have them, then I think it's really critical that you appoint competent managers, that the people that are in charge of state-owned enterprises, that's just as responsible a job as being in charge of a private company. So it cannot be a bureaucrat, and you need to probably give them adequate remuneration so that they have an incentive to do the job properly. And then you need to make sure that they have some level of supervision. And usually it's best if that's not a political body, but a body of experts with the right set of qualifications. So that's the system of state-owned enterprise governance that countries like Singapore or several European countries have put in place. When you look, it's surprising that actually state-owned enterprises are quite common in a number of countries. They're maybe not as strong in the economy as they are in Sri Lanka, but a lot of countries have state-owned enterprises, and in many countries these enterprises don't lose money, but that requires them to be well regulated. And then there are some in Sri Lanka, I think, where it's pretty obvious the government doesn't need to be in that sector. I mean, governments shouldn't need to run hotels. Very few governments nowadays run airlines. Not a lot of governments are successful at running telecom companies. So there are areas where international experience suggests the private sector can operate more effectively, and so those would be, those would be areas where, and that's where IFC is working, where privatization may be the way to go.
You mentioned earlier too about complications, and I read this in a World Bank statement when you spoke about the new country partnership framework. When you talk about complications may arise when we embark on this reforms program as we go forward, how should Sri Lanka be mindful of mitigating these complications moving forward?
Well, I don't know what exactly what complications you have in mind, but I do think for any reform program to be successful, it's very important that there is continued communication, because most people are not, are not economic policy makers. They're not economic policy experts. So it's really important that people understand why you're doing it. What's the objective? I think Sri Lanka, has a good story to tell. Look, a year ago, look at how deep the crisis was. We had to do these reforms. The result has been that inflation has come down, that the exchange rate has stabilized. I think a similar story needs to be told on the structural reforms that are still needed. Right now, there are not enough jobs. People are leaving, many people are leaving Sri Lanka. If you want these people not to leave, or if you want them to come back, you need to offer them economic opportunities. Those opportunities are not going to come from going back to the old system. They're going to come from continuing the reform effort, from encouraging more private investment, from saying Sri Lanka is open. We want to be a competitive economy. We want to move up the value chain. We want to become an upper middle income and maybe ultimately a high income country. We want to attract more tourists. Singapore, which is a much smaller population than Sri Lanka, attracts, I think, more than 5 times as many tourists than Sri Lanka does. So, those are the opportunities. That's what you want to be telling people. That's what you're aiming for. And I think, His Excellency the President has talked about this in his budget speech. Recently, he gave an address to the nation to try and do that. But everybody in the government needs to continuously do that and explain so that people, see what is in it for them. Ultimately, without that, they're not going to understand, and the public support will not be sufficient.
Right, I think it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. We're in conversation with the visiting Vice President for South Asia region of the World Bank, Mr. Martin Greiser. We'll be back after this short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we are in conversation regarding the World Bank's country partnership framework for Sri Lanka. We were talking about Sri Lanka's economy, a way out, but especially when we look at a model that works for the Sri Lankan economy. We've been talking about an export-based economy and propelling industries to support the economic growth. However, we're still not there. We're looking at now quick fixes and long-term plans and a long-term sustainable growth mechanism. But what are your observations here, and what examples from success stories would you draw for us here?
Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that the move, the way that countries become high-income countries is not overnight. Yeah, even the very fast-growing countries take several decades to get there. So I think what's important is the persistence and the sense of direction, and then continued progress over a number of years, actually decades. What inspiring models could there be out there? I think East Asia offers a lot of interesting models of countries that have succeeded based on export-led growth. But there are also some countries in in Eastern Europe or in North Africa, even in Latin America, that have done quite well. And Sri Lanka has a good natural resource base. It's a strong agriculture producer. It has a good, very strong tourism potential. So it'll probably, be more service-oriented, more than the traditional manufacturing growth models of the past, and that's reflective of a shift that we're seeing in the global economy, where services jobs are much more prominent. So, every country, you can't just copy what other countries have done, but the key ingredients of bringing in investment, upgrading the technology, investing and continuing to invest in human capital, making sure you have an even level playing field domestically that encourages domestic entrepreneurship, investing in infrastructure, to improve competitiveness and connectivity. Those are some of the ingredients that have helped other countries and that could help Sri Lanka.
What policy priorities must we focus on, especially when we talk about FDIs and creating a conducive investment climate for foreign direct investments?
Well, we talked about the level playing field. I think that's important. We talked about transparency and predictability. You can't change the rules. If someone's going to put several $1 million in a country, particularly a foreign investor who may not fully understand the domestic political environment so well, if you change the rules all the time, they're going to get very confused and others are going to be discouraged. So I think stability is important, predictability, transparency. And then there are, certain things that you can do in particular sectors. And for that, the World Bank is probably not the best placed, but I do think it's really important that you have active outreach to investors, that you ask them, what is it that would bring you to Sri Lanka? What is it that would bring, I think the chairman of Tata was in Sri Lanka just today. What is it that would make him invest, that would make Tata invest in Sri Lanka? What is it that would make a European company or an American company come here? And depending on the sector, that may be a different set of issues.
We were talking about, especially after Sri Lanka announcing a soft default first, the creditworthiness of the country. Now with the reforms program, how do you observe and what have you got to tell us about Sri Lanka's creditworthiness when we talk about investments and those who are looking at Sri Lanka?
Of course. Yeah, I think, as I said at the very beginning, we've made good progress, but we're not yet over the hump. I think we do need that agreement from the creditors. We do need the certainty that Sri Lanka's debt servicing costs are going to fall to the levels defined by the IMF program. And by the way, these are levels that were defined in relation to countries that are so-called market access countries. So those are countries that in principle have access to the capital markets. I think Sri Lanka is in a situation that doesn't leave a lot of room to be more generous. And if anything, the debt burden, even after the restructuring, will still be quite high. So continued discipline will be important. But with successful implementation of the program, yes, I do think Sri Lanka will become more attractive for investors and will regain its creditworthiness. But it will require persistent implementation. What you can't do is abandon ship, because you think it worked after 6 months and then say, okay, let's we're out of the worst, let's go back to what we were doing before. That's not going to work, and I think that's a very important message, that it requires persistent efforts.
Was Sri Lanka downgraded? We were talking about the reverse graduation program, but there was a lot of concern in the market whether this is a downgrade or what this really is.
No, not at all. I think on the contrary, it helps improve Sri Lanka's creditworthiness because it provides concessional resources, long-term concessional resources, to finance the investments that Sri Lanka needs in the public sector. I think every country would be happy to have concessional resources. It's just that those resources are not super abundant, and so we need to be careful that we provide them to countries that need them most. I think what the reverse graduation did it was an expression of the support from the Ada shareholders to say, yes, Sri Lanka really is in a very bad crisis. Sri Lanka cannot afford at the moment to pay market rates. Sri Lanka does need more concessional money. Incidentally, this is one of the points that some of the bilateral creditors like China have also been making. And so, you know, from the World Bank side, we said, okay, we're going to lean forward. We are going to provide those concessional resources, but that on its own is not going to be sufficient. We need the support from the other creditors, and ultimately we need the reforms to bring in the private investment.
We were also talking about investments and controversial investment projects in the country. These have been matters of concern within the country, but in terms of World Bank's purview in the country and support to Sri Lanka, how do you recommend Sri Lanka work around these controversial projects and with our partners going forward, especially to overcome this crisis?
Well, I mentioned the level playing field before. When something is controversial, it usually is because it's not transparent or it's a special deal and people don't exactly know who benefits. That makes them controversial. So our recommendation is to be even-handed, to offer the same environment to everybody, to make it transparent what the conditions are, and to hope to attract investment on the basis of the value proposition of the country, the hard-working people of Sri Lanka, the good education that they have, the excellent location with a good port that you have, the natural assets that Sri Lanka has. That should be the value proposition, not a giveaway, not a special deal. And if you operate that way, the serious investors will come, the people that look at this underlying value proposition, and that's the way forward.
And how will female labor force participation, seriously taking this as an important factor to economic growth, help Sri Lanka going forward?
Well, you know, no economy can hope to realize its full potential if half of the labor force isn't realizing its full potential. So what we know in development is that if in countries in which the conditions are such that women are encouraged to work, are able to contribute, are able to fully develop their talents, their skills, make an equal contribution to the economy, economic growth is higher. And Sri Lanka in the South Asia context is not the worst, but in the international context is still far below the average that other middle-income countries have been able to reach. And so, you know, for example, some legislative norms were approved at a time when it wasn't normal that women would go to work, and so there was a sense that one should protect women from certain types of work like night shifts, etc. Well, in today's economy, where many service jobs may require a different kind of working hours, and women are just as able to do those, that legal protection turns into a barrier for greater female labor force participation. So instead, what public policy should be trying to do is, how can we support women? By providing good security, by providing good public transport, perhaps by providing more childcare. You know, those kinds of measures are likely to be better for the women because it allows a woman to make a choice. Do I want to work without having to give up a family life at the same time? And it's good for the economy because ultimately women are half of the population, and oftentimes just as, you know, always just as talented, sometimes more talented than the men. And so they should be given their chance to contribute.
Certainly. We're in the final few minutes of our discussion, but what recommendations does the World Bank and you, especially with your current visit in Sri Lanka, have for Sri Lankan authorities and policymakers from the context of this crisis and reforms?
Well, just in very short summary, stay the course on reform. Progress has been made, but we're not yet over the hump. It requires persistence and patience, but eventually the returns will be there. And the other recommendation would be continue to explain this to the people of Sri Lanka, who have been very resilient, who've been through so much difficulty in the last 12 months. And who are probably tired. And if you tell them that, you know, they need to continue the course of reform. Some of them may ask you why. I think explaining what the upside is, showing that this is the right direction to go. We can only provide support, but ultimately this transformation, this crisis as an opportunity, is something for the Sri Lankan people to realize, and hopefully they will, and hopefully the government will continue to lead in that direction.
I'm assuming you didn't have much time, even during your short visits, to explore the warmth of the country's hospitality.
I absolutely have. I enjoy every time I'm here. This time round, I'm only in Colombo. Last time I had a chance to visit other parts of the country. It's a beautiful place. I'm recommending my family to come. It's a great place for a holiday. It has wonderful history. You can see some extraordinary both natural and historical sites, and you can also relax on the beach. You can have very good food. So I'm enjoying my visits, and I appreciate and thank you and the Sri Lankan people very much for receiving me so warmly.
Thank you very much for your time here at Hyde Park and for your visit to Sri Lanka.
Thank you.
We had with us the Vice President for South Asia region of the World Bank, Martin Reiser, joining us here at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24 to discuss Sri Lanka's way out of the crisis and support from development partners, especially the World Bank, and recommendations going forward. I'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another episode of At Hyde Park here at AdaDerana. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.